The earthquake in Chile, which is actually, the rest of the world sort of perceived it as an earthquake, but in Chile, it was both an earthquake and a tsunami. So inland areas were affected, communities were affected by the earthquake and very massive shaking. It was the sixth largest earthquake in recorded history in a very large area, 600 square kilometers, so a huge area of devastation. And in terms of percent of damage as a percent of GDP, which is the way we sort of measure, it was one of the most massive levels of devastation for a country and its ability to absorb and handle that level of devastation. But on the coastal communities, a tsunami wave inundated dozens of coastal towns and communities and absolutely wiped them out. The three communities that we work heavily in, Copacabana, Dichato, and Perales, Dichato and Perales were both hit by the tsunami wave and were virtually completely destroyed as communities and had to rebuild from scratch. Copacabana was also a coastal community, but was spared from the tsunami wave because Copacabana was the epicenter, so the tsunami wave sort of radiated out from there. But Copacabana was a historic community with a lot of adobe buildings, beautiful old historic town. And adobe performs very poorly in earthquake shaking, so majority of the buildings in the town of Copacabana collapsed. And fortunately, no lives were lost in any of the towns, those three towns. There were in other communities, but in those three towns, fortunately, people were able to get out and survive. But what they came back to was complete devastation. In Chile, we implemented what we call a community-based approach to disaster recovery, and it's a community-centric model. So one of the things that makes it as a fairly unique approach is it's a place-based approach. So many foundations, NGOs come in after, or even governments come in after a disaster and work on recovery and are sort of issue-focused, healthcare or housing or education, rebuilding schools, et cetera, which is good, and you have to be issue-focused. Except that the problem is there you're working with silos, and people who've gone through a disaster and who've survived and are trying to recover from a disaster are not in silos. They have, you have to start with sort of the family and the neighborhood. And a family has economic issues, housing issues, psychological and issues. They need schools for their kids. They need livelihoods. And so what you really have to do is take a place-based or community-based approach where you go in and work with families and neighborhoods and entire communities across all of their issues and make sure that you solve all of the issues simultaneously. Because to rebuild a school but not to rebuild housing, or to rebuild housing but not rebuild schools, you haven't solved the problem. You have to go in and look at all of the issues. So we break those into sort of four segments: the built environment or physical recovery, economic recovery, social and psychological recovery, and cultural and historic recovery, because restoring culture is as important as restoring the physical environment. When you think about recovery and the whole concept, it's encapsulated in the word itself. No one from the outside can actually help a community recover. A community has to recover themselves, just as, for example, it's in many ways very similar to recovering from the loss of a loved one, the death of a spouse or of a child, etc., is that internally you have to go through grief and the processing of loss and then rebuilding one's life after after that. And it's a very similar sort of thing psychologically to an individual or a family or even an entire community after a disaster. But just as you could never say that a counselor or someone from the outside could ever have someone recover, help someone recover, or make someone recover from the loss of a spouse, people have to come through that and recover themselves and rebuild their lives themselves and come through the grief and the trauma themselves. Similarly, after a community going through a disaster has to recover itself. It can be assisted and it can be counseled and even resources brought in from the outside, but that resources do not make for recovery. A community actually has to truly rebuild itself. Therefore, most of the actual resources for recovery of a community, of what we consider of getting back to normal, of rebuilding an economy, of rebuilding families, of piecing lives back together and getting back on to a sense of normalcy after a disaster, all actually come from internal strengths and resources within the community, supplemented with external resources, which are obviously important, but then also, most importantly, often the missing ingredient is the technical expertise and the advice and the counseling that come from the outside. To me, universities are actually a perfect partner in providing the resources to communities after a disaster for community-based recovery, because of when you think of all of the different needs in terms of expertise that a community has to deal with, all the problems that it has to solve, there are things from economic and business recovery to agricultural issues to environmental damage that needs remediation to architecture and urban planning to public policy issues and governance issues to psychological issues to health issues. And when you think about who sort of has all of that expertise under one roof, it's a university. So we find that universities make great partners with communities in providing that sort of sense of resources where you can bring in an expert on, soil composition, because, for example, in Dichato and Perales that were devastated by tsunami, the salinization of the soil from the saltwater intrusion into the meant that either you had to remediate the soil to be able to grow crops again, or you had to find crops that could actually tolerate a higher salinity in the soil. And experts on agriculture and on biology were absolutely necessary for that. And in that same community, you needed people who could work on and do mental health counseling and provide, and then you needed people from the School of Education to come in and work with how to rebuild schools and get education restarted in the community, and people from the business school to come in and work with on business restoration and livelihood restoration. So universities are a great way to bring the resources into a community. And it doesn't actually take, I think we make a mistake in the disaster recovery world thinking that it's all about the built environment and that it's just write a check and disaster recovery is done. The greatest contribution we can make to a community after a disaster is to bring in the technical expertise to work with communities to solve each of the myriad problems that they have. So sort of the first rule of doing any kind of community-based recovery work is to you never renounce your expertise, but you always have to sort of put it on the back burner and then engage with the community and listen to the community and truly understand their needs, their strengths, their capabilities, and then try and plug your expertise into that to help them further those strengths and expertise. So one sort of lesson or example of that is we were working in the community of Paralis, very small, about 500 families or so living in a very rural, fairly isolated community. Some fishing, mixed between fishing and agriculture. And there was a woman who, we were actually doing sort of livelihood restoration grants where people would come to us with their needs, and we would give them grants to restore their livelihoods. So one woman she had been planting strawberry plants, and she'd been a strawberry farmer and needed strawberry plants to replace the ones that she'd lost in the tsunami. So we gave her a grant of a few $100s to go out and buy new strawberry plants. But she actually used that money, instead of buying strawberry plants, used that money to buy pigs. And then she raised the pigs, fattened them up, and then sold the pigs at market and used that money to send her daughter to school. Now, other NGOs or experts might come in and say what a horrible thing that she actually reprogrammed that money to use it to do something that was not intended by the experts, not approved by the experts, et cetera. But actually, what in terms of community-based recovery, at the end of the day, you have to understand that she knew more about what was important to her family and her needs than any expert from the outside could ever know or understand. That she had to make, and did make, the priority decisions about what was important for her family. And at the end of the day, it may actually be less sustainable if she'd bought strawberries or had just raised the pigs and kept the pigs, that it might have been sustainable. And that was the original concept that we were talking about. But instead, she used the money to send her daughter to school, which in the long run, she prioritized for her family the welfare of her daughter. The long-term welfare of her daughter was far more important to her than the short-term or even long-term sustainability based on strawberry farming. So one of the most important pieces of recovery is actually reestablishing that sense of self-control, of being able to control one's own destiny and one's own life again, and rebuild that sense of control. And when outsiders come in and just do things for a community, it actually does nothing to help the community rebuild that sense of control. In fact, if anything, it actually treating a community like victims that just need to be, have no say in their future or in their matter, actually only reinforces that trauma and that sense of loss of control. And so if you come in and work with the community and not only include them in the decision-making process, but actually say, no, this is your decision-making process. You are in control of your own recovery. You have to be. There is no substitute for that. And we're here to help you in that process. And then make sure that the community is incredibly engaged in their own recovery and putting their lives back together. It actually then speeds up and accelerates the recovery process, because people are, through the process of being engaged in the recovery, the individuals are actually feeling and building that sense of control and building their sense of identity and of place, of community, of family, is all being restored in that process. So the act of engaging a community in their own recovery is actually one of the key tools for recovery itself.